Caleb emerged from the cabin's cellar, cradling a frail, trembling figure in his arms. Her eyes reflected decades of fear and loneliness as the blizzard that had threatened to bury them forever finally began to relent, revealing the first rays of golden sunlight piercing the dark clouds above the Montana mountains. But to understand how a solitary woodsman became the savior of a lost soul in the icy depths, we need to go back 3 days, when it all started with a simple decision seeking shelter. Caleb's axe bit into the frigid air with precision, each swing echoing through the snow-covered slopes. At 42, he had learned to read the mountains like others read books. He knew when the wind shifted, when clouds heralded a storm, when nature whispered its warnings. His grizzled beard was coated with ice crystals, and his blue-gray eyes, though weary, held the steely determination of one who had chosen to live far from the complications of the civilized world. "One more tree, then I head home," he muttered to himself, watching the clouds gathering on the horizon. But the wind blew with unexpected force, carrying snowflakes that danced like ghosts among the pines. In minutes, what had begun as a breeze turned into a raging gale. Caleb knew the signs. Sudden mountain storms in Montana could be fatal to those unprepared. He stowed his axe in his pack and started walking against the wind, following a trail he had memorized over the years. But the snow was now falling with such intensity that familiar landmarks vanished in seconds. That's when he spotted the cabin. Nestled in a clearing among the pines, the structure seemed forgotten by time. The wooden planks, once surely golden, now displayed a gray hue, marked by decades of rain and snow. The roof sagged under the weight of successive winters, and one window was boarded up haphazardly. Yet, for a man caught in a deadly storm, that cabin represented the difference between life and hypothermia. Caleb approached the door, noticing it was ajar, swinging gently in the wind. He pushed it open slowly, and the creak of rusty hinges mingled with the howl of the storm. As he crossed the threshold, a strange smell hit his nostrils, something metallic and sweet that made his stomach clench. "Hello," he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty space. "Is anyone there?" Only silence answered, broken occasionally by the cracking of wood. Caleb pulled a flashlight from his pack and illuminated the interior. The cabin was larger than it appeared from the outside, with a single main room, a stone fireplace at the back, and a wooden staircase leading to a loft. Furniture covered in dusty sheets occupied dark corners, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like macabre curtains. But it was the marks on the wall that caught his attention first. Deep scratches in the wood, as if human fingernails had tried to carve something or claw something out. Caleb ran his fingers over the marks, feeling the roughness of the splintered wood. They weren't random scratches. There was a pattern, a desperate urgency in those grooves. "What the hell happened here?" he whispered. He decided to explore further. He moved some furniture, searching for clues about the former occupants. Under a dust-covered table, he found a diary with yellowed pages. The first entries dated back 15 years, written by someone named Thomas Brennan. "Brought Eleanor to this cabin, hoping the mountain air would help with her condition. She's been different since the accident. The doctors say it's trauma, but sometimes she talks about impossible things, as if she lives in 2 worlds simultaneously." Caleb continued reading, increasingly disturbed. Thomas described episodes where Eleanor seemed not to recognize where she was, spoke to invisible people, and insisted that something or someone was trying to take her away. The entries became more desperate over time. "Eleanor disappeared during the night. I searched the whole cabin, screamed her name until I was hoarse. When I finally found her, she was in the cellar, a place I swear didn't exist before. She was huddled in a corner, whispering about the voices in the walls." The last entry was almost illegible, written in a shaky hand. "I can't do this anymore. Eleanor is lost somewhere inside herself, and I don't know how to bring her back. I'll leave her here, where she feels safe, in the cellar. Maybe the voices she hears will keep her company better than I could." Caleb closed the diary, a weight settling on his chest. Eleanor, a woman lost, abandoned in this isolated cabin, but that was 15 years ago. She couldn't be. A muffled sound came from somewhere below his feet. Caleb froze, listening intently. The sound came again, as if someone were moving slowly in a confined space. He shone his flashlight on the floor, looking for an entrance. In the darkest corner of the cabin, under a torn rug, was a wooden trapdoor secured by a rusty lock. His heart pounded. The diary mentioned Eleanor in the cellar, but Thomas had been gone for 15 years. Could it be? Caleb grabbed a tool from his pack and forced the lock until it broke. The trap door creaked open, revealing a wooden ladder descending into darkness. A smell of dampness and mildew rose from the hole, mixed with something else, a human odor of someone who had lived in close quarters for a long time. "Eleanor," he called softly. "Eleanor, are you there?" For a moment, only silence. Then a raspy, trembling voice emerged from the depths. Who's there?" "Thomas, is that you? Are you back?" Caleb felt a chill run down his spine. She was alive. After 15 years alone in that cabin, Eleanor Brennan was still alive. The cellar descending those stairs was one of the hardest decisions Caleb had ever made. With each step, the smell grew stronger, and he could hear ragged breathing from the bottom of the cellar. When he finally reached the dirt floor, his flashlight illuminated a small damp space with rough-hewn stone walls. In the far corner, huddled beneath piles of soiled blankets, was a human figure. Eleanor Vance had gray, tangled hair cascading over her thin shoulders. Her skin was paper pale, and her eyes, still green, but faded, flickered in the lantern light like those of a nocturnal animal. She must have been beautiful once, but 15 years of isolation and neglect had transformed her into something almost spectral. "I'm not Thomas," Caleb said softly, keeping his distance to avoid startling her. "My name is Caleb. I got lost in the storm and found your cabin." Eleanor tilted her head, studying him with the distrust of someone who had long since lost faith in human kindness. "Thomas said he'd come back," she murmured. "He promised, but the voices in the walls said he lied." Caleb looked around the small space. There was evidence of a life lived on the fringes of sanity, piles of empty cans, buckets serving as makeshift toilets, and on the walls, hundreds of scratches, as if Eleanor had spent years marking time or trying to communicate with something unseen. "Eleanor," he said gently, "how long have you been down here?" She laughed, but it was a joyless sound, fragmented like broken glass. Time stopped when the voices started. "They told me to stay, told me it was safe here, away from him." Him, Thomas. The word came out as a muffled scream. He didn't understand. "After the accident, I could hear things others couldn't. Voices of people who had passed through here, stories from the stones, whispers on the wind. He thought I was crazy, but I was just awake." Caleb began to understand. The trauma had awakened in Eleanor an enhanced sensitivity, an ability to perceive nuances of reality that others ignored. Instead of receiving help, she had been isolated and eventually abandoned by the one who should have protected her. And yet, there's a kind of intelligence in stories like these that makes us reflect on how many people around us may be living their own versions of isolation. If you've been following reports like this, consider subscribing to continue receiving narratives that explore the depths of the human experience. "I can help you get out of here," Caleb offered. "The storm will pass, and we can find a better place for you." Eleanor's eyes widened in panic. "No, they're waiting outside, the men in uniforms, the doctors with their needles, all those who wanted to lock me away because I saw things they couldn't see. Down here I'm safe. The voices protect me." Caleb realized that forcing the situation would be counterproductive. Eleanor had built a world where the cellar represented safety, and the voices she heard were her only companions. Removing her abruptly would be like tearing up the roots of a delicate plant. "Can I stay a while?" he asked. "Just until the storm passes. I promise I won't force you to do anything." Eleanor watched him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "The voices say you're different. They say your heart has no lies." Caleb sat down on the dirt floor, keeping a respectful distance. "Tell me about the voices. What do they say?" And Eleanor began to speak. At first hesitant, then with growing confidence, She described a world rich in invisible details. She told of the pioneer couple who built the cabin in the 19th century, of the Native Americans who considered that mountain sacred, of lost travelers who had found shelter there over the decades. Caleb listened, fascinated. Eleanor wasn't crazy, she was a kind of involuntary medium, someone whose traumatic sensitivity had connected her to the historical layers of that place. But her gift had been misinterpreted as mental illness, and she had been punished for something she couldn't control. The next morning, Caleb went upstairs to get supplies from his backpack, and found the storm still raging outside. He returned to the cellar with fresh food and clean water, gifts that Eleanor received as if they were miracles. "How long has it been since Thomas came?" he asked, while she ate. "A long time," Eleanor replied vaguely. "At first he came down every week, then every month, then the voices said he wouldn't come back anymore." Caleb felt anger rising in his chest. How could a man abandon his wife like that? But as Eleanor began to tell more details about Thomas's last days in the cabin, the situation became more complex. "He was afraid of me," Eleanor whispered. "I'd start talking about things I saw, and he'd turn white as a sheet. One night, I woke up and he was standing beside the bed, just watching me, like I was some dangerous animal. That's when I knew I needed to come here, to the safe place." "You came here of your own free will." "The voices told me to come. They knew Thomas was planning to take me to one of those places, hospitals, where they do terrible things to people like me." Caleb began to understand the full tragedy. Thomas, likely terrified by his wife's condition, and lacking resources to cope with it, had considered forced institutionalization. Eleanor, sensing the danger, had taken refuge in the cellar, and Thomas, perhaps out of cowardice or misguided mercy, had left her there. "Eleanor," Caleb said carefully, "have you ever thought about leaving? Not for a hospital, but to live normally?" She looked at him as if he had suggested flying. "How? Where? I don't exist anymore in the world up there. I have no papers, no money, no nobody. You have me." The words tumbled out before Caleb could fully process them, but the instant they left his lips, he knew they were true. There was something about Eleanor, a damaged purity, a wisdom forged in suffering, that had ignited in him a protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed. Eleanor studied him with her faded eyes. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" "Because I was a stranger once too," Caleb replied. "I was someone the world decided to ignore." And then he told his own story. How he'd lost his family in a car accident 15 years ago, the same time Eleanor had retreated to the cellar. How guilt and grief had driven him to the mountains, where he'd spent years living as a hermit, chopping wood and avoiding human contact. How he'd built his own prison of isolation, different from Eleanor's, but equally real. "The difference," he said, "is that I chose my solitude. Yours was imposed upon you." Eleanor was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "The voices say you're telling the truth. They say it might be time." By the third morning, the storm had passed. Caleb climbed up and found the world transformed into crystal. Ice-covered trees glittered like diamonds in the rising sun, and the air was so pure it stung his lungs. It was one of those moments where the beauty of nature was almost painful. He descended to the cellar one last time, and found Eleanor sitting in the same spot, but something had shifted in her eyes. There was a light there that hadn't been there before, not the light of madness, but of possibility. "The voices told me a story last night," she said, "about a man who lived alone in the mountains because he was afraid of hurting someone again, and about a woman who lived alone because she was afraid of being hurt. They said that maybe two fears together can make courage." Caleb felt something stir in his chest, an emotion he'd kept buried for 15 years. "Eleanor, I can't promise it will be easy. I don't know how we'll explain where you've been, or how we'll resolve the matter of the documents, but I know no one deserves to live like this." "I know," she replied. And maybe it's time to stop listening only to the voices of the past and start listening to those of the present. She extended a trembling hand, and Caleb helped her to her feet. Together, they climbed the stairs, each step representing a move away from the past and toward an uncertain, but possible, future. When they emerged into the main room of the cabin, Eleanor stopped and looked around, as if seeing the place for the first time. Sunlight streamed through the grimy windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air. It was the first time in 15 years she'd seen direct sunlight, and her eyes filled with tears. "It's more beautiful than I remembered," she whispered. Caleb watched her rediscover the world, every detail, the sparkle of the snow outside, the shy warmth of the sun on her pale face, the sound of birds singing in the trees. Everything seemed new and miraculous to Eleanor. It was like watching someone being reborn. "We need to take it slow," Caleb said. "My cabin is a few hours' walk away. Do you feel up to it?" Eleanor nodded, though her legs visibly trembled. The voices said this was the time. They haven't lied before. Before they left, Caleb did something Eleanor didn't expect. He picked up Thomas's diary and placed it carefully in one of her hands. "Why?" she asked. "Because it's your story too, and every story deserves to be told completely, not just the pieces others choose to remember." The walk along the snow-covered trail was slow and arduous. Eleanor stumbled frequently, her muscles weakened by years of inactivity protesting the movement. But with each step, her breathing became deeper, freer. It was like watching a long-closed flower finally opening to the sun. They stopped to rest in a clearing, where a stream flowed beneath a thin sheet of ice. Eleanor knelt by the water's edge and saw her reflection, her first in 15 years. The face that stared back was unrecognizable, gaunt, lined, aged, but in the eyes, Caleb could see something that hadn't been there in the cellar. "Hope, who am I now?" she asked, touching the water's surface with her fingertips. "You're Eleanor," Caleb replied simply, "and that's enough to start." They continued walking. Along the way, Eleanor began to speak less to the unseen voices and more to Caleb. She told him about her life before the accident. She had been an elementary school teacher, loved gardening, dreamed of traveling the world. Small details of a normal life that had been interrupted and then forgotten. "Do you miss teaching?" Caleb asked. "Every day," she replied. "Even in the cellar, sometimes I pretended I was in a classroom, explaining things to imaginary children. The voices used to help me, whispering historical facts I could use in the lessons." Caleb smiled, his first genuine smile in years. "Maybe you can teach again, not in a traditional school, but there are always children who need someone who understands what it's like to feel different." The arrival Caleb's cabin was small but cozy, built by his own hands over the years. Solid wood, a stone fireplace, windows offering a breathtaking view of the mountains. To Eleanor, who had lived in a stone box, it was a palace. "It's yours," Caleb said, seeing the wonder in her eyes. "Ours," Eleanor softly corrected. "If you really meant what you said about helping me." The first few days were rough. Eleanor had nightmares, waking up screaming about voices calling her back to the basement. Her body, unaccustomed to freedom, reacted with anxiety to open spaces. But Caleb remained patient, offering silent presence when she needed it, and space when she asked for it. Slowly, Eleanor began to bloom. She discovered Caleb's kitchen and started preparing meals, timidly at first, then with growing confidence. Her hands, idle for 15 years, rediscovered the joy of creation. She cleaned the cabin, organized Caleb's tools, and even started a small garden in a sheltered area near the door. "How did you know I liked gardening?" she asked, one afternoon, her hands covered in dirt as she planted seeds in a wooden box. "I didn't," Caleb replied. "But your hands did."
The transformation weeks passed. Eleanor stopped talking about the voices as separate entities and began referring to them as memories or impressions. Her sensitivity remained. She still perceived things others didn't, but now there was context, control, purpose. One afternoon, while Caleb was chopping wood, Eleanor brought him hot tea and sat on a nearby log to watch him work. There was something different about her, a quietude that wasn't born of fear anymore, but of peace. "Caleb," she said, "can I tell you something the voices told me about you?" He stopped chopping and looked at her, curious. "They said you came to the mountains, not just to escape pain, but to punish yourself for something that wasn't your fault. They said you carried the weight of not being able to save your family, so you decided you didn't deserve to be saved." Caleb felt his chest tighten. In all those years alone, he'd never articulated his feelings so clearly, but Eleanor, or her voices, had touched the core of his truth. "And what else did they say?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "That by saving me you saved yourself too. That sometimes healing comes not when we stop feeling pain, but when we transform that pain into compassion for others who suffer." Caleb put down his axe and sat beside her. "Eleanor, you weren't saved by me, you saved yourself. I just offered a ladder for you to climb out of the hole others dug. Maybe," she smiled, "or maybe we saved each other." The recognition 3 months later, an unexpected event tested the new life they had built together. A rescue team, searching for a missing climber, arrived at Caleb's cabin. Among them was a doctor who, after a conversation with Eleanor, recognized the symptoms of what was now known as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. "She needs proper treatment," the doctor told Caleb privately. "What she's been through, that doesn't heal with just goodwill." Caleb felt the familiar fear constrict his throat. Would they take her away, force her back into the world that had hurt her so much? But Eleanor, who had overheard the conversation, approached calmly. "Doctor," she said, her voice clear and firm, "I appreciate your concern, but I spent 15 years being treated as if I were broken. Now for the first time, I feel whole. If there's treatment that can help me better integrate my experiences without separating me from them, I'm interested, but I won't leave my home again against my will." The doctor looked between Eleanor and Caleb, seeing something that surprised him. This wasn't a traumatized woman being kept in isolation by an unstable man. This was a woman who had found healing through choice, dignity, and unconditional love. "There are therapists who make house calls," he said finally. "People specializing in complex trauma, who understand that healing happens where the patient feels safe." The acceptance doctor Sarah Chen arrived at the cabin one spring morning when the mountains were covered in wildflowers. She was a middle-aged Asian American woman with kind eyes and a way of speaking that was neither judgmental nor rushed. "I didn't come here to fix anyone," she said in her first session with Eleanor. "I came to understand your experience and perhaps offer tools to help you navigate the world more easily." Over months, Dr. Chen worked with Eleanor, not to eliminate her sensitivity, but to refine it. She taught grounding techniques that helped Eleanor distinguish between impressions from the environment and her own emotions. She showed how her ability to perceive subtle details could be a strength, not a weakness. "You have something called sensory hypervigilance," Dr. Chen explained. "It's common in trauma survivors. Your brain learned to pick up on minimal signs of danger, but what started as a survival mechanism has become a unique way of perceiving the world." "So the voices," Eleanor began, "are real," Dr. Chen said firmly. "They are emotional echoes, psychic impressions, environmental memories. You're not crazy, Eleanor. You are deeply empathetic and intuitive. Society just doesn't know how to deal with people like you." A year after emerging from the basement, Eleanor was almost unrecognizable. Her hair, now clean and styled, gleamed silver in the sun. She had gained healthy weight, and her eyes had regained their vibrancy. But the biggest change was in her posture, upright, confident, peaceful. She and Caleb developed a routine that honored both her need for tranquility and her desire for purpose. In the mornings, he chopped wood while she tended the garden, now flourishing with vegetables and medicinal herbs. In the afternoons, she wrote, first just for herself, then small articles for a local magazine about sustainable mountain living. But it was when a family of tourists got lost during an unexpected blizzard that the true extent of Eleanor's transformation was revealed. The couple and their 2 young children arrived at Caleb's cabin, shivering with cold and panic. Eleanor immediately took charge, preparing hot drinks, finding blankets, soothing the children with gentle stories about mountain animals who knew their way home even in the dark. "How did you know exactly what to do?" the mother asked later, watching Eleanor gently play with her children while they waited for rescue to arrive. "I know what it's like to be lost," Eleanor replied simply, "and I know what it's like to be found." The following spring, Dr. Chen brought an unexpected proposition. "There's an organization that works with traumatized children," she said. "They're looking for someone with personal experience in recovery, someone who can understand what these children are going through. The work would be remote, with some occasional visits. Would you be interested?" Eleanor looked at Caleb, who nodded encouragingly. "You were born to be a teacher," he said. "Maybe it's time to teach the most important lessons you've learned." And so Eleanor began a new career, not as the elementary school teacher she had been decades before, but as a counselor specializing in childhood trauma. Her ability to perceive what the children couldn't verbalize, to sense their unexpressed emotions, became her greatest professional tool. She worked primarily via video call from the cabin, but occasionally traveled to treatment centers, where she met the children she helped in person. Caleb always accompanied her on these trips, providing the emotional anchor she still needed when facing the outside world. "You're like a lighthouse," said one of the children she worked with, an 8-year-old girl who had been found living alone after her parents disappeared. "You shine, and it helps me find my way back." Eleanor smiled, remembering Caleb's own words years before. "Sometimes 2 fears together make courage." 2 years after her emergence from the cellar, Eleanor made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She wanted to return to the cabin where she had been abandoned. "Why?" asked Caleb, worried that the visit might trigger a regression. "Because there are other voices there," Eleanor explained, "other stories that need to be told. And maybe there are other people like me, in other dark places, who need to know that it's possible to get out." Chen supported the idea, seeing it as an important step in what she called narrative reclamation, the process by which trauma survivors rewrite their stories of victimization into narratives of survival and growth. The walk back to the abandoned cabin was strange and emotional. Eleanor walked with firm steps along the trail she had traversed 3 years earlier as a broken woman being carried to safety. Now she returned as someone who had transformed her pain into wisdom, her isolation into connection, her fear into compassion. The cabin seemed smaller than Eleanor remembered, more dilapidated. Nature had begun to reclaim it, vines growing up the walls, leaves piled on the floor, small animals nesting in the corners. But when she descended into the cellar, for the first time in 3 years, something extraordinary happened. Instead of panic or sadness, Eleanor felt a profound sense of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered to the stone walls. "You kept me alive when I didn't know how to keep myself alive. You gave me the stories that taught me I wasn't the only person who ever felt lost." Caleb watched her with growing admiration. The fragile, terrified woman he had found had transformed into a force of nature, not through denial of her experience, but through complete acceptance of it. And now, he asked. Eleanor smiled, picking up a small digital recorder she had brought. Now I document the stories, all of them, so that no one else will be forgotten. Eleanor spent the following years collecting and preserving stories of people who had been marginalized, forgotten, or misunderstood. Her unique sensitivity allowed her to connect with individuals whom other professionals couldn't reach. She became a bridge between worlds, the visible world of mainstream society and the invisible world of those who existed on the margins. Her reputation grew quietly. Families sought her help when loved ones disappeared into the labyrinth of the mental health system. Isolated communities invited her to document their oral histories. Researchers consulted her on phenomena they couldn't explain through traditional methods, but Eleanor never forgot her origins. Every week she and Caleb took hikes in the mountains, visiting places where others had gotten lost, literally or metaphorically. They left small markers, a carefully arranged pile of stones, a piece of colorful fabric tied to a tree, small signs that told anyone lost, "You are not alone. There is a way back." Topped and tilted her head, listening to something only she could perceive. "There's someone out there," she said softly. "Someone lost. Someone who needs help." Caleb smiled, recognizing the pattern. "Where?" "About 2 miles north. A young woman. She's Enoch. She's afraid to go home." Without hesitation, they changed direction, because this was their calling now, to find the lost, offer shelter to the homeless, be a bridge between hopelessness and possibility. The storm had passed, but other storms would come, and when they did, Eleanor and Caleb would be ready, not as saviors, but as fellow travelers, not as healers, but as witnesses to the infinite human capacity for renewal. In the icy mountains of Montana, where blizzards muffle even the sound of one's own thoughts, two people who had been given up for lost created a beacon of hope that would shine for any soul brave enough to emerge from the darkness and walk toward the light. And on the walls of the old abandoned cabin, if you knew how to listen, you could still hear whispers, no longer of despair and abandonment, but of gratitude and renewal. Stories of how love can bloom in the most unlikely places, how healing can emerge from the greatest suffering, and how sometimes, just sometimes, two broken people can come together to form something whole and beautiful, and profoundly, undeniably human.